Outside the main entrance of Harrington Tower in downtown Vancouver, a black woman in a cleaning uniform was mopping the lobby floor at 7 in the morning when the building's owner stepped off his private elevator and told her to move. She moved. She did not say anything. She pulled the mop bucket 2 feet to the right and kept her eyes down. Martin Calloway did not say thank you. Martin Calloway did not look at her. Martin Calloway walked past her the way a man walks past furniture, which is to say he did not walk past her at all. She simply stopped existing when she was no longer blocking his path. Her name was Delia Mensah. She was 31 years old. She had been mopping floors in this building for 11 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. Before that, she had spent 8 years as a combat engineer with the Canadian Armed Forces, 2 tours in Latvia, 1 in Mali, a commendation she kept folded in the pocket of her uniform because it was the only pocket she had left that nobody could take anything out of. Martin Calloway had no idea who she was. He was about to find out. I'm Blake, and the stories I dig up tend to be the ones somebody paid a lot of money to make sure you never heard. This one didn't cost anybody anything to bury. They just assumed a woman with a mop would never be the one to unbury it. They assumed wrong. To understand what happened on that lobby floor on a Thursday morning in February, you have to understand 2 mornings that started in the same city, but in entirely different versions of it. Martin Calloway woke at 6 in the Ambleside house. The house had 7 bedrooms and used 4 of them. His espresso arrived before he was dressed, brought by a housekeeper whose name he had not learned in 2 years of employment. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window in his master's suite and looked out at the water, and he thought about the press conference scheduled for noon. In 72 hours, Calloway Meridian Properties was announcing the acquisition of 14 social housing sites across the Lower Mainland. Not to preserve them, to redevelop them. 3,000 low-income units gone. The city council had been managed. The rezoning was done. All that remained was the announcement and the ribbon and the smile. He put on his $700 shoes. He straightened his tie. He told his reflection that today was the kind of day that defined legacies. 20 minutes, east and 12 floors down from anything Calloway had ever set foot in. Delia Mensah woke at 4:45 in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Vancouver that she shared with her younger brother. Her brother was 19 and studying civil engineering at BCIT on a partial scholarship that covered exactly 60% of his tuition. She covered the rest. She also covered the rent, the groceries, the transit passes, and the cost of the textbooks the scholarship did not include. She made coffee in the dark so the noise of the kettle would not wake him. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. The document she opened was 43 pages long. She had been building it for 7 months. She did not have a law degree. She did not have a journalism degree. What she had was 8 years of military training in the reading of structural assessments, load-bearing tolerances, and engineering reports. And a dead mother who had lived in the Ferndale Commons housing complex in Surrey for 19 years before the mold in the walls of her unit gave her a lung infection that her body, already worn down from 40 years of overnight shifts, could not fight off. Her mother had filed 3 complaints with Calloway Meridian's Property Management Division in the 18 months before she died. All 3 had been marked resolved. None of them had been. Delia knew this because she had pulled the inspection records. She had pulled them the way a combat engineer pulls a site assessment. Methodically, completely, without assuming anything is where it's supposed to be. She had found the falsified remediation reports. She had found the subcontractor who had signed off on work that was never done. She had found the internal email thread in which a Calloway Meridian regional director had written, and she had memorized the exact words because she read them every morning before she left the apartment. These tenants are not going anywhere, and they have no leverage. Process the paperwork and move on. Her mother's name had been Abena Mensah, She had come to Canada from Ghana in 1987 with $40 in a suitcase, and she had worked every day for 34 years, and she had never once asked anyone for anything she had not already earned. Delia folded the laptop. She put on her uniform. She kissed 2 fingers and pressed them against the photograph on the refrigerator. Her mother at her brother's high school graduation, standing very straight, wearing the dress she had saved for. And she took the 7:12 SkyTrain to downtown Vancouver. She arrived at Harrington Tower at 6:58. She clocked in. She filled the mop bucket. She began with the lobby floor, the way she always did, because the lobby floor was where the marble showed every footprint, and the building manager wanted it spotless. Before the executives arrived. She was halfway across the second quadrant when Martin Calloway stepped off his private elevator, and that is where this story begins to tilt. Delia moved 2 feet to the right. She kept her eyes down. She watched his $700 shoes cross the floor she had just cleaned, and she did not say a word. But Martin Calloway stopped at the door. He turned around. He looked at her the way men look when they have decided to find something unsatisfying about a situation that was, until a moment ago, perfectly satisfactory. He said, "You've left streaks by the north pillar." Delia looked at the north pillar. There were no streaks. She said, "I can go over it again, sir." He said, "This is why we have standards. Do it again. All of it, from the beginning." A security guard near the desk looked at his shoes. The receptionist, who had just arrived, kept her eyes on her screen. A facilities manager coming through the side door slowed, assessed the situation, and kept walking. Delia looked at the floor. She looked at the man. She looked at the floor again. She said, "Yes, sir." She went back to the beginning. She started over. She mopped the floor that did not need mopping while Martin Calloway held the door open with one hand and watched. And then she heard him say, just loud enough that the security guard could hear, "I don't know why we don't just contract this out. You get what you pay for with these people." He walked out. Nobody in the lobby said a word. Delia finished the floor. She rinsed the mop. She checked her watch. She had 40 minutes before her break. She used them. She walked to the 7th floor, where the building's administrative offices were. She sat down in the stairwell with her phone. She opened an encrypted messaging app. She sent a single message to a number she had not used since January. The message said, "He's here, noon today. I'm ready if you are." The reply came in 40 seconds. "I've been ready since October. Building entrance or side street?" Delia typed, "Side street." "I'll be the one in the uniform." The person on the other end of that message was a woman named Rochelle Tremblay. Rochelle was 38, an investigative journalist with the Cascadia Record, and she had been working the Calloway Meridian housing file for 14 months. She had 3 sources, 2 of whom had asked for anonymity, and 1 of whom had simply disappeared from her contact list the week after Calloway's lawyers had sent a cease and desist to her editor. Delia Osimensa was not her source. Delia Osimensa was something Rochelle did not yet have a clean category for. She was the person who had walked into the Cascadia Records offices 7 months ago carrying a manila envelope and asked to speak to whoever covered housing. The receptionist had offered her a form. Delia had said politely that she would wait. She had waited for 2 hours. Rochelle had come down to the lobby at 6 in the evening after a day that had not gone well and found a woman in a cleaning uniform, sitting very straight in one of the lobby chairs with a manila envelope on her knees. And the kind of patience that is not patience, so much as it is the decision to have already accepted however long this is going to take. Rochelle had bought her a coffee. She had asked 2 questions. She had not spoken again for 40 minutes while Delia laid 43 pages across the conference room table in an order that Rochelle would later describe to her editor as the clearest structural argument I have ever seen a non-lawyer make. Delia had said, at the end of it, "My mother died in one of his buildings. I want that on record before we go any further, because I want you to know why I'm here, and I want you to decide whether that's a problem." Rochelle had said, "It's not a problem. It's a reason." They had met every second Wednesday for 7 months after that. Now here is the thing I want you to sit with for a second, before we go back to that side street. Martin Calloway was not a stupid man. He had built a property portfolio worth $4.2 billion across British Columbia and Alberta. He had navigated 3 municipal elections, 2 provincial inquiries, and 1 very uncomfortable Globe and Mail piece that his communications team had managed to reduce to a single correction on page B7. He had survived everything that had come at him because he was careful, and because he was fast, and because he understood, with the instinct of someone who has been in rooms where money decides things, exactly how long a problem could be ignored before it had to be solved. He had been ignoring Ferndale Commons for 3 years. He had been ignoring it because the tenants were low income and unorganized, and the complaints were routed through a property management layer that absorbed them, and because his general counsel had told him twice that the exposure was manageable. He had been ignoring it the way you ignore a slow leak in a building you are planning to demolish anyway. He had not considered that the daughter of a woman who died in that building might have spent 8 years learning how to read structural reports in the service of the Canadian government. He had not considered her at all. This is the mistake powerful people make. They stop considering the people they have stopped seeing. At 11:47 in the morning, Martin Calloway came out of Harrington Tower's main entrance onto Burrard Street. He was heading to the press conference site 4 blocks north. His communications director was beside him. His legal counsel was 2 steps behind. A photographer from his own team was already positioned at the venue. On the side street to his left, a woman in a cleaning uniform was standing next to a woman in a gray coat holding a recorder. Calloway's communications director saw them first. She touched his arm. He looked. He registered the uniform. He registered the recorder. He did not at first register the face. Then he did. He stopped walking. Rochelle Tremblay said, "Mr. Calloway." Rochelle Tremblay from the Cascadia Record. "I have some questions about Ferndale Commons and a set of remediation reports filed between 2021 and 2023 that we believe were falsified." "Do you have a moment?" Calloway's legal counsel said immediately. Mr. Calloway has no comment at this time. Calloway did not look at his legal counsel. He looked at Delia. Delia did not look away. She was standing straight, the way she had been trained to stand, hands at her sides, weight even. The posture of someone who has decided in advance that whatever happens next was always going to happen, which means there is nothing left to be afraid of. Calloway said, "I know you." Delia said, "Yes, sir," he said. "You work in my building." She said, "I worked in your building. As of this morning, I've submitted my resignation effective immediately." She paused. I wanted to be clear about that before this conversation continued. Calloway's communications director said, very low, "Martin, we need to move." Calloway did not move. Rochelle said, "We have the inspection records for units 412 through 419, Mr. Calloway. We have the subcontractor invoices, and we have the internal correspondence from your regional director, dated March of 2022. We also have testimony from 3 current and former Ferndale Commons tenants and a statement from a licensed building inspector who reviewed the original remediation reports and found that the work described in them was not performed." She paused. "We also have a copy of Abena O.C. Mensah's 3 formal complaints, each of which was marked resolved in your system within 48 hours of submission. Abena O.C. Mensah died 14 months ago of a respiratory infection. She had been in Unit 414 for 19 years. Calloway's face had changed. It was not white exactly. It was the color of a man doing very fast arithmetic and not liking the answers. His legal counsel said, "This is completely inappropriate, and we will be." Delia said quietly, not to the lawyer, to Calloway. She filed the first complaint when I was in Latvia. I didn't know until I came home. She didn't want me to worry. Nobody said anything for a moment. Calloway said, I was not personally involved in the management of... Page 7, Delia said. Third paragraph. Your signature is on the 2022 Regional Compliance Sign-Off. You signed it on April 14th. My mother filed her second complaint on April 9th. There are moments in a commiseration when the person with all the power understands that the coordinates have shifted and there is no version of the map they are holding that shows them where they are now. Martin Calloway was in one of those moments. You could see it in the way he held very still, the way a man holds still when he is trying to decide whether stillness or movement is the better option, and has not yet realized that the time for deciding has already passed. Rochelle said, We're publishing tomorrow morning. I'm giving you the opportunity to respond on the record today. You can reach me at the number I've sent to your communications office. She looked at the communications director 48 minutes ago. The communications director's phone was already in her hand. She looked at it. She looked at Rochelle. She looked at Calloway. Calloway said, I need to make a call. He turned and walked back toward Harrington Tower. His legal counsel followed, already talking into his own phone. His communications director stood for a moment longer, and then she looked at Delia, and whatever she was going to say, she did not say. She just turned and walked. Rochelle switched off the recorder. She said to Delia, You didn't have to be here in person. Delia said, Yes, I did. Rochelle said, You know what happens now. His lawyers are going to. I know what his lawyers are going to do, Delia said. I've been preparing for that since October. She picked up her bag. My mother used to say that the worst thing about injustice is not that it happens. It's that people make themselves comfortable inside it. They find a way to not see it. She looked at the tower. I want him to have to see it. Just once. I wanted to be the one standing there so that he had to look at it. Rochelle said, He did look. Delia nodded once. She said, I know. I have to stop here for a second because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, what does this woman actually have? Is this enough? And I want you to understand that the 43 pages Delia carried into that conference room 7 months ago were not the beginning of what she had built. They were what she felt comfortable putting on a table in front of a stranger. What she had actually built was closer to 90 pages by the time Rochelle filed her story. And it included something that Calloway's lawyers had not accounted for. Because they did not know it existed, because the only person who knew it existed was a man named Francois Beaumont, who was a retired fire inspector from the city of Surrey, who had conducted his own inspection of Ferndale Commons in November 2022, and had written a report that had never been entered into any official record, because 2 days after he submitted it to the city's housing division, he had received a phone call that he described as strongly suggesting he revise his findings. Francois Beaumont had not revised his findings. Francois Beaumont had retired 3 months later, and he had kept a copy of the original report in a filing cabinet in his garage in Langley, and he had kept it because he was 71 years old and he had spent 32 years doing this work, and he knew what falsified documentation looked like. And he was not the kind of man who destroyed things because someone on a phone suggested it. Delia had found him through a Freedom of Information request. She had driven to Langley on a Saturday morning and knocked on his door and explained who she was and who her mother was and what she was trying to do. Francois Beaumont had invited her in. He had made tea. He had said, I was wondering when someone was going to come. He had given her the report. He had agreed to speak to Rochelle on the record. He had also, without being asked, provided the name and number of a second retired city employee who had received a similar phone call about a different Calloway Meridian property in Abbotsford in 2020. By the time Rochelle's story published at 6 a.m. the following day, she had 4 named sources, 2 official documents, 1 signed affidavit from Francois Beaumont, and a statement from BC Housing confirming they had opened a review of Callaway Meridian's provincial contracts. The headline read, "Remediation Reports, Falsified." Tenants left in mold-filled units as Callaway Meridian prepared redevelopment bid, documents show. By 9 in the morning, the story had been picked up nationally. By 11, 3 members of Vancouver City Council had called for an independent audit of the 14 housing sites named in the redevelopment proposal. By 2 in the afternoon, 2 of the 3 institutional investors backing the acquisition had issued statements saying they were reviewing the matter. By 4 in the afternoon, Martin Callaway's communications team released a statement saying he was committed to transparency and had engaged external counsel to conduct an internal review. He did not mention Abena OC Mensa. He did not mention Ferndale Commons. He did not mention the name of the woman who had mopped his lobby floor that morning. On a side street in Vancouver, a woman in a cleaning uniform, who was no longer employed as a cleaner, read the statement on her phone. She read it once. Then she put the phone in her bag, and she walked to the SkyTrain, and she went home. Her brother was at the kitchen table with his engineering textbooks when she came in. He was 19, and he had the same careful eyes as their mother, and he had not yet heard the news because he had been in class all morning. He looked up and said, "You're home early." She sat down across from him. She said, "I resigned this morning." He said, "Oh." He looked at her face. He said, "Is this about Mum?" She said, "It was always about Mum." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did it work?" She thought about Martin Callaway on the sidewalk. She thought about the way his face had changed when she said April 9th. She thought about Francois Beaumont making tea in a kitchen in Langley and saying, "I was wondering when someone was going to come." She thought about her mother standing very straight in a photograph on a refrigerator, wearing the dress she had saved for. She said, "It worked." Her brother did not cry. He was 19, and he had been holding things together for 14 months, and he had done it with the particular stubbornness of someone who learned very young that falling apart was a luxury and that some people could not afford luxuries. But he put down his pencil, and he did not pick it up again for a long time. What happened after is the part people do not always want to hear because it does not resolve the way a resolution is supposed to resolve. It is slower and harder and more complicated than a headline. The BC Housing Review took 4 months. It found deficiencies in 11 of 17 Callaway Meridian properties. It found that remediation work totaling approximately $3.8 million had been billed to provincial housing contracts and not performed. It found that 6 properties had active mold conditions that met the threshold for emergency remediation orders. Ferndale Commons was one of them. The City of Surrey issued Martin Callaway a formal notice of violation. His general counsel negotiated a consent agreement. Callaway Meridian paid a settlement of $2.1 million to the provincial government, and a separate fund was established for current and former tenants who had been affected by the conditions. The fund was administered by a third party. The eligibility criteria were broad. It was not enough. It was not nothing. Callaway's legal team, as Delia had predicted and prepared for, filed a civil claim against her alleging breach of employment confidentiality. The claim was withdrawn 4 months later, after Rochelle published a follow-up piece that included the internal email from the regional director and the full text of Francois Beaumont's affidavit. Delia's lawyer, a woman named Ingrid Solverson, who had spent 20 years doing housing rights work in BC, and who had taken the case for what she described to her assistant as the reason I went to law school, filed a counter-application. It was settled privately. Delia did not return to cleaning work. She enrolled in a part-time urban planning program at Langara College. She was not sure yet what she wanted to do with it. She was 31 years old, and she had already done several things, and she was not in a hurry. What she was, every second Wednesday, was at a meeting of the Ferndale Commons Tenant Association, which had been formally registered as a society in the province of British Columbia, 3 months after Rochelle's story ran. She was not the president. She had said clearly that she did not want to be the president. She sat at the back of the room, and she answered questions when people had them, and she helped people fill out the forms for the remediation fund, and she told anyone who asked that the forms were long, but they were worth filling out. One evening in late autumn, an elderly man who had lived in Unit 416 for 11 years asked her why she had come back. He meant why she kept coming to the meetings, why she was still there when the newspaper story was over and the cameras had moved on. She said, "My mother lived here for 19 years. After she died, I was angry for a long time. I thought anger was enough." She was quiet for a moment. "It's not enough. You have to build something or the anger just becomes the thing you carry." The old man nodded. He said, "What are you building?" She said, "I don't know yet, but I know what the foundation looks like." On a morning in November, Delia stood in the kitchen of the apartment above the East Vancouver street where she had grown up. The photograph was still on the refrigerator. Her brother was at school. She made coffee and she sat at the table and she opened the laptop and she looked at the document that had been 43 pages 7 months ago and was now something else entirely. A template, a guide, a set of tools she had developed and was beginning quietly and without announcement to share with other people in other buildings in other cities who had the same thing she had started with: a dead parent, a falsified report, and the particular patience of someone who has decided in advance to stay as long as it takes. She kissed 2 fingers, she pressed them to the photograph. She said out loud to a kitchen that was empty except for her, "I'm still building, Mum. I'll tell you when I know what it is." Then she picked up her coffee and she got back to work. Some people are invisible inside a building until the day they decide not to be. Some people have been doing the quietest, most careful work in the country while someone else rehearses their press conference on the 96th floor. Some people mop the floor twice because they were told to and then go upstairs and finish what they started. And sometimes on a February morning in Vancouver, the person who was told to move ends up being the one who doesn't. If this story mattered to you, stay with us. The next one is about a hospital orderly in Halifax, a pension administrator who made one phone call he was told to make, and the single sticky note that should never have survived a shredder.